So today we will be starting. Welcome back with the foreign policy after independence to the end of Cold War. Last session I have discussed about the looking at international relations with the Kautilya's eyes. Okay, and what is the power center? How to be effective regarding the relations? What are the seven treatments we can give to the allied partners? Either they are like powerful than us, or like we are powerful than them. These were the criterias. Now let's see. After when the India got independence, what was the foreign policy? Important thing for you to be noticed. See, after the World War, what was after the like this independence of India? What was the situation? Now, situation was India was divided, and this divide was a multi-divide section. It was a multiple divisions. Like we were first thing we can simply say like we were divided between India and Pakistan. So there was a ideology of Hindu Muslim. Now how this can affect Hindu Muslim ideology can affect to us because Arab Peninsula, how they are going to see to us. This can be a one reason or one source through which the things are going. And apart from that, there was a literacy divide. Literature wise division was there, like some section of the people were literate and other were majority of them were illiterate. The persons who fought for independence with the world eye, they were seen as a revolutionaries. So the country, as other countries were expecting a sudden growth of India. Okay, so there was some kind of a positive impact because of the leadership of the country, but apart from that, in house we were having so many discrepancies. We were looted for 200 years on every day, every single minute our money was going out with the foreign land. And still, after these many years also, the scars of that loot is still there. So what happened? The worldview and the principles laid down India's classical treatise on the statecraft are in many ways evident in the conduct of independent India's foreign rule. It should be repeated here that we should be careful not only to mechanistically apply these principles to the contemporary situation. The principles are best seen in the frame of reference that influences decision making in the foreign policy. Now, before we analyze independent India's foreign policy and its resonance with the past and present, we need to have a conceptual clarity on what constitutes foreign policy, and also what constitute a diplomatic policy. Now, understand what do you mean by foreign policy. Now, foreign policy guides a state relation with other states. First thing, its relation with the regional and multilateral organizations as well. Increasingly in a globalized and interconnected world with non-state actors and civil societies as well that recognizes no border, like this UNDP and all. In broader sense, foreign policy is a strategy of a state. Is a strategy a state adopts to advance its national interest as articulated by its political leadership, but within the contested geopolitical space characterized by the complex interstate relationship. There is a degree of relativity to the calculation of national interest which must take into the account that the interest of other states. There is a constant process of bargaining and seeking a trade-off between the competing objectives. National interest, therefore, cannot and should not be ascribed absolute value. It is the within a zone of relativity that diplomacy can enable accommodation, compromise, conciliation amongst the state. Assigning the absolute value to the perceived national interest may undermine rather than enhance the national security. It can preempt cooperation with the other state and lead a situation that adversely affect the interest of the state. Like for example, while negotiation with Indo-US nuclear deal, the question of future nuclear weapon testing by India was a contentious issue. Okay, are we going to do a nuclear test? Now, there was an argument insisting that the right of India to test such weapon in the future should be incorporated in the agreement. On the other hand, the Americans wanted a specific provision that the corporation would come and end if India did indeed carried out a nuclear test in future. India would not accept that legal undertaking not to carry out nuclear tests at the future dates. Equally, it would be have been unreasonable for it to insist that right to be right to test be legally recognized by the state which had a comprehensive test ban treaty. Giving up their legal entitlement to the test. You will found a comprehensive whereby our right to test was left to our sovereign decision, even though we implicitly acknowledged we could not insist on our partners continuing their civil nuclear cooperations with us if we were decided to test. To insist that our right to be test be explicitly acknowledged in any international instruments would have been a nature of a demand based on an absolute interpretation of national interest and would have precluded any creative compromise with retain this right for us even with the recognition of interest of our partners. Now there is a situation when public opinion is inflamed and the people demand action by the state without regard to the prudence that quarterly considered the key principle of a statecraft. Prudence, prudent, be wiseful, be knowledgeable, be realistic. We see this often in the Indian media coverage of Chinese activism on our borders of the neighborhood. The state should not allow itself to be pressured by the public opinion into action, and this led to the consequences worse than the original problem. A foreign policy seeks to safeguard and wherever possible expand a country's strategic space. This concept is best understood as the capacity of a state to take a relative autonomous decisions on the matter of vital interest. The more the options or alternative available to the state to achieve its objective, the more is the capacity is enhanced. In international relations, the fewer the alternatives available to you, the more likely that friends will take you for granted and advisories will be emboldened to undermine you. So you should have a multiple option attitude rather than having a one single way to achieve your destiny. Therefore, a successful foreign policy is one that provides a country's political leadership with a range of options or alternative to draw from the from to achieve its defined objectives. Now, diplomacy concerns the implementation of foreign policy. Diplomacy means implementation of the foreign policy objective using a range of instruments. Using a range of instruments such as interstate dialogue, negotiation of treaties, rules or norms, and influencing of external political and public opinion, and influencing external political and public opinion. To borrow a military analogy, foreign policy may be likened to a weapon and a diplomacy to its delivery system. If diplomacy is weak, then even the best foreign policy would be ineffective. Diplomacy must not be confused with the foreign policy, and shortcoming of one should not be ascribed to other. So diplomacy means implementation of the foreign policy, like what is your objective and how the objective is going to get achieved. For that, the work what you do, that is diplomacy. Now what does a diplomat do? He is a datta or an envoy. His role is being described in Arthashastra also and Kamandaki Niti Shastra. The principles and practices of diplomacy, K.M. Panikar, relates an episode of Mahabharata to illustrate Sri Krishna. When he was being requested by Yudhishthira to go to a special envoy to court of Kauravas, was asked by Draupadi what is his purpose in undertaking a so hopeless mission. He replied, I shall go to the Kaurava court to present your case in the best light, to try them, to get them accept your demands, and if my efforts fail and war becomes inevitable, we shall show the world how we are right and they are wrong, so that world may not misjudge between us. All the secrets of diplomacy are contained in the statement of this Krishna. So, जब कृष्ण भगवान जा रहे थे कौरव के कोर्ट में कि 5 गांव दे दो हमको, तो द्रौपदी ने पूछा कि क्या पर्पस है, क्यों जाना चाहते हो, युद्ध तो होने ही वाला है, तो युद्ध करते हैं, क्यों टालने का प्रयास। बोले नहीं, पहले उनको पूरी तरीके से इन्फ्लुएंस किया जाएगा या उनसे बात रखी जाएगी कि मेरे को ये चाहिए, आप दे सकते हो कि नहीं। अगर इफ स्टिल दे आर नॉट agreeing for that and still like war will be happening, तो हम लोगों को दुनिया को बताना पड़ेगा कि हम सही हैं और वो गलत है, so that after winning we should have the power। हमारे कि हम जीत भी गए but the world is seeing with a bad eyes, it should be not there। So one should also be aware that in practice of diplomacy, it is important to separate substantive content of policy from the public projection. For a diplomat, the first order of business is to determine the substance of the policy measure based on the India's national interest. How it is to be packaged for a public is to be determined thereafter. Taking into the account of public opinion, environment both at home and abroad. For example, the competitive relationship between India and China is a reality that India foreign policy has to have to contend with. However, it has so far been convenient for both of the countries to show that neither is threat to each other, and there are enough space in Asia for both of the world, that is India and China, to rise together. In other case, public projection may serve to reinforce the substantive policy. For example, in post-independence, non-alignment in substance a policy assuring relative autonomy to a new emerging country in a polarized international environment. However, non-alignment was also presented to the public as an ethical posture contributing to the international peace, promoting solidarity amongst the countries emerging from a colonial rule. And the public posture reinforced the substantive policy. The diplomat must be constantly aware of this and never confuse the policy with a rhetoric. The quote, for every nation places its own interest first in developing foreign policy. Fortunately, India's interests coincide with the peaceful foreign policy and cooperation with all progressive nations. Now, I believe India's foreign policy is well thought out and crafted as a reasonably potent weapon. It is our delivery system that leaves much to be desired. There is also a tendency amongst the political leaders. And often even amongst the professional diplomats to confuse rhetoric with the substance. Whether India foreign policy should be based on unalloyed realpolitik, bereft of any moral and ethical anchor. Now you need to find out who has given this concept of realpolitik. It came from Germany. Any moral and ethical anchor, or whether it should aspire the higher purpose transcending in some ways the way essentially competitive characters of interstate relationship is a matter of choice. Now there is a starkly utilitarian, even brutal world of Kautil Shastra with its reliance on Sam, Dam and Dand Bhed. There is also the world of Ashoka's Dhamma, which its novel view of state policy, infusing it with a moral obligation for the welfare of the people. Chanakya theories were from the perspective of an aspiring hegemony in multi-state environment. How to gain a power into a multi-state environment. His client is a revisionist state trying to overthrow the existing order. Ashoka approach was more appropriate to a self-satisfied hegemonic state trying to preserve the existing order, a status quo power. In contemporary parlance, the appeal to higher principle is often hallmark of hegemonic state. Okay. So, see, there was good foreign policy during the time of Ashoka also, good foreign policy during the time of Chanakya, Chandragupta also. The Chanakya and Chandragupta, their policies were influenced because they have just now thrown a ruler from the throne and now they need to derive a new foreign policy because like see अगर जैसे कि किसी जगह पे किसी देश में कोई सत्ता बदलती है और सत्ता परिवर्तन आता है now other countries who are witnessing you they are a bit confused they cannot predict like what will be a new relation with them now. But when you have a state which you are holding for a longer period of time and people have your perception how is your relation with them, then you can follow the higher principles with them. But there is also sense of common humanity in Indian temperament. There is an echo of more ancient Hindu concept Vasudev Kutumbakam, which translate into common humanity. These contrasting strains often intertwined and have been constant features of Indian foreign policy since independence. Foreign policy in India context is deeply influenced by the worldview I have written about the first chapter in the book. It was also influenced by the history, particularly the bitter experience of the foreign rules and humiliation. Now, there is a political consensus in India that country must never again allow. There is a political consensus in India that country must never again allow the subordination of its people to alien rule or domination. This underlies India's search for autonomy in all activities in the global arena, a running theme in post-independence foreign policy behavior. This is also the essence of non-alignment as promoted by India's first Prime Minister Pandit Nehru and remains underpinning for our current foreign policy even if the label of non-alignment is no longer favored. Now, Nehru was also convinced that the extent of India territory, its large population, its civilizational identity, its growing economy marked the country for a global role and influence. It was his conviction that non-alignment foreign policy would enable India to pursue its destiny for a greater power. Now, non-alignment as a guiding principle of Indian foreign policy was adopted by Nehru soon after independence. It is important to understand that the domestic and international setting in which policy is enunciated. Non-alignment as a guiding principle for Indian foreign policy was adopted by Nehru soon after independence. Now, it is important to understand that the domestic and international setting in which policy is enunciated. The end of Second World War brought with it the hope of enduring international peace and the end of colonial rule across the world. The creation of UN heralded a more inclusive and a relatively democratic pattern of global governance. Even though it did not find a place in the exclusive club of UN Security Council, where the five victorious nations constituted a privileged global steering committee with a veto power, India welcomed the new institution as a platform of newly independent countries such as itself participate in the shaping of the post-war international order. To the leader of New India, the particular Nehru, the coincidental dawn of an atomic age with the threat of mass annihilation placed a very significant responsibility on UN to maintain peace and international security. So for the time being, the UN Security Council and the facts of its permanent membership were tolerated as a practical response. The relatively swift evident or the Cold War put new independent India and the other developing nations emerging from colonial rule in a dilemma. There were now two military blocs in the world, one led by US and other led by Soviet Union, whose growing ideological difference was threatening the world peace. To become a part of one or the other alliance would inevitably lead to the subordination of the national interest to the demand of the alliance and particularly demand of the alliance leaders. Thus, if India had Thus, if India has become an ally of US during the Cold War, it would have to treat the Soviet Union as an enemy state despite there being no threats to Indian interest from the latter. It may have had to fight alongside the US in the Vietnam War despite having no stakes. Now, this would be a negation of very independence India had fought for. Concept of non-alignment was the response to this dilemma. India decided rightly in retrospect that its interest would be better served by staying out competing alliance system. On the contrary, the country would have a better chance of preserving its precious political freedom and promoting its economical development by maintaining the friendly relationship with both blocs. Now, for Nehru, non-alignment was different from neutrality. Like, it is not like we are not going to get involved with both of the countries, but it is different from aligning with someone, which would have meant not only taking a position on the issue under the dispute between the competing powers. Non-alignment meant active engagement and the role in dealing. Now, non-alignment meant active engagement and the role in dealing with the key regional and international issues of the day. India's delegation to the UN had a big hand in drafting a historic declaration of human rights, and it was India that mobilized the UN against apartheid, that is like racism, in South Africa. It emerged as a relentless champion in the early global movement for the creating of world-free nuclear weapons, despite opposition from nuclear weapons state. India has not hesitated to play an active role in several regional conflicts and to undertake UN peacekeeping mission, a traditional that continues to this day. In early post-independence period, India was a country of choice to head International Control Commission on Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. It also served as the Korean Armistice Commissions after Korean War. Now, this was the result of non-aligned that India being seen as a credible and trusted international actor able to work as a bridge between Cold War rivals. The growing ranks of the countries emerging from the colonial rule placed a great confidence in India. Now, the reputation may have diminished somewhat after India defeat in the border war with China 1962. But India continued to be a champion for the cause of the developing countries in the succeeding decades too. Under Indira Gandhi, later Rajiv Gandhi, India regained the prominent international profiles in the areas such as disarmament, environmental affairs, international economic governance, and North-South dialogue. Now, as a young diplomat representing India at the Conference of the Disarmament in Geneva, UN in New York, he observed with a great pride the respect shown to India by the large constituencies of developing countries. They often took their cue from us in articulating their own position and sought out advice on various topics. We were called upon to help the draft of union document to speak on behalf of developing countries in many international conflicts. This profile is lark sharp as we seek to pursue the foreign policy become more narrowly focused on our own interest. The developing world too no longer stand as one. It is diversity of interest making it difficult to arrive to a common position. Now there is a perception that non-aligned restriction India's security choices during security war. The record shows otherwise. Non-alignment assured that the country its autonomy is in a realm of its international relations. Despite being outside military alliance, India was able to pursue security arrangement with several friendly countries, even for the acquisition of defense hardware and technology. When access to the Western arm was restricted after the India-Pakistan War of 65, India was able to craft a partnership with Moscow which enhanced its long-term military preparedness. A strategic partnership is different in nature from a military alliance because it is based on the equal relationship anchored in a shared interest. Both India and Soviet Union has shared concern about China and Pakistan, which enjoyed the support of both US and China. This alliance also helped India deflect growing pressure from the West to make concession to Pakistan on Kashmir issue. The West made this a condition for its continued supply of arms to India in the wake of India-China border war. It is important to make a distinction between non-alignment as a foreign policy choice for India and non-alignment movement. As pointed out earlier, India became a national leader amongst the newly independent countries across Asia and Africa. And many of which wished to preserve their hand-won political independence. They wanted to join the hands for more equitable international order that would also support their developmental aspirations. The Afro-Asian Conference at Bandung 1955, which was initiated by Nehru and supported by Indonesian President Sukarno, was a precursor to the NAM. It was the first major gathering of developing nations across the ideological and political affiliation and had even China amongst the participants. The conference consolidated the role of uncommitted nations that saw themselves as an agency for a peace between Cold War rivals and respective alliance. Now in 1961, led by Nehru, Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, and Yugoslavia, Joseph Broz Tito, the NAM was born as a movement of developing countries that shunned military alliances and wished to jointly play a role into promoting peace, disarmament, and development. Leadership of NAM also fetched India's great political leverage in its relations with the superpower and their allies, compensating to some extent its lack of significant economic and military capabilities. While the NAM lost much of its relevance with the end of Cold War, non-alignment as a principle governing India's foreign policy remained relevant to this date. Now it is fashionable to trash the idea of non-alignment these days as a moralistic posture that neglected India's vital interest. While it is true that India's projected non-alignment as an expression of an ethical foreign policy favorable to the international peace, and this position was based on realistic assessment of Cold War geopolitics and requirement of maintaining countries' room for maneuver. Now in 2014 book of World Order written by Henry Kissinger, the most powerful diplomat ever this nation, US has seen, has acknowledged the logic behind non-alignment, drawing the interest parallel to between India and US own. India conducted during Cold War was very similar to that of USA in its formative decades. Emerging into the world established power at the Cold War, independent India, likely early US, skillfully elevated freedom of maneuver from a bargain tactics into an ethical principle. Blending righteous moralism and shrewd assessment of the balance of the forces and major power psychology, Nehru announced India to be a global power that would chart a course of maneuvering between major blocs. He also appreciates this policy. The essence of this strategy was that it allowed India to draw support from both Cold War camps, securing a military aid, diplomatic cooperations of the Soviet blocs, even when quoting America's development assistance and the moral support of the US intellectual establishment. However, irritating to the Cold War America, it was a wise course of emerging nations with a nascent military establishment and underdeveloped economy. India would have been respected by but secondary ally in either superpower camp. As a free agent, it could exercise a much wider reaching influence. Now, during the Cold War era, the India pursued a policy of economic self-reliance, rejecting the export and foreign investment, later growth strategic favored by the East Asian and later South Asian countries. That did not prevent it from being a principal character in international trade negotiation for a new and equitable international economic order for the activism that continued WTO, World Trade Organizations. What drives India's increased influence as a major power today? It's a confluence of tradition of global political engagement with more recent global economic engagement. Increased participation in the global economy through trade and investment has also transformed the more nature, scope and scale of its political engagement with the world. But it must be recognized that the new engagement is still aimed at increasing India's influence and relationship with the other countries, multiplying its development and security options, multiplying its development and the security options, preserving its ability to take relative autonomous decisions on the matter that are vital national interest. In that sense, the spirit of non-alignment remains a compass for India's foreign policy. Even though the original Cold War context no longer exists, this will be apparent when we later examine how India responded to dramatically transform international environment with the end of Cold War. However, overall foreign policy also took shape in response to a crucial challenges that has confronted following the birth of independent India. Like in early years of independence, two major development occurred, which was remained the defining element in India's foreign calculation. The first was partition of India in 1947 and attendant conflict with Pakistan over Jammu and Kashmir. The barrier now appeared both political and geographical in the form of Pakistan occupied Kashmir, which includes the region of Gilgit and Baltistan. This stood in the way of India's land access to Afghanistan and Gulf, West Asia, Central Asia. While India was able to retain the major part of Jammu Kashmir, it did not recover Gilgit and Baltistan, which would have at least assured access to Afghanistan and Central Asia. In the present date, India, Afghan and Central Asian strategy is severely constrained as a result. In the East, the East Pakistan reduced India's access to the northeast to a narrow and threatened corridor. The creation of an independent Bangladesh in 1971 reduced the security threat, but relative isolation of India's northeast is only now being tackled as a relationship between India and Bangladesh to improve. The second development of annexation of Tibet by China, which was the first time in history extended a relative short border between China's Xinjiang province and India Jammu Kashmir state for a vast frontier between Asia's two longest countries. This impinged directly on India's strategic space. Over the past 7 decades, it is the impact of persistent consequences of these two developments that have greatly complicated India's foreign policy concern at the subcontinental level. The China-Pakistan alliance, which crystallized over the time, we'll discuss in the upcoming chapters. The China's occupation of Tibet in 1950s initially created a condition for India to consolidate its presence and influence in sub-Himalayan regions like Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, and were in early years fearful of China. India was able to continue with the traditional British policy of guaranteeing their defense and remain a dominant presence of the country. With the respect of island countries of Sri Lanka and Maldives, India inherited the mandate of providing for their security as British power receded. Meanwhile, the overwhelming reach of US Navy did create anxieties which manifested advocacy of Indian Ocean as a zone of peace. Now, India responds to the local crisis in the neighborhood that impinged on and had the potential to impinge on its security interest, also influenced by evolution of its foreign policy. Like example, India's intervention in Myanmar in 1950s, which enabled its Prime Minister, new government to counter Karen insurgency threatening the country's heartland. In 1971, Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi dispatched a security force to assist her Sri Lankan counterpart, Shirimavo Bandaranaike, to tackle JVP uprising in the island. The same year, Indian military intervention helped to create independent Bangladesh as a major strategic gain. In 1975, perceiving the threat of succession by Sikkim ruling Chogyal, the territory was incorporated into the Indian Union. In 1980s, India took a decisive action by sending India's peacekeeping force to secure its interest in Sri Lanka, then embroiled in a violent civil war against Tamil militants. In the same decade, India's intervened military into Maldives to prevent an attempted coup against its president. And throughout 90s, it gave military financial assistance to Northern Alliance fighting the Pakistan-sponsored the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. Some of the India's intervention have been political and diplomatic. India played a role of restoration of multi-party democracy in Nepal also during the tumultuous event in 2005 and 4 and 5 when the Nepali monarchy was forced to yield to the civilian political coalition. The Maoist insurgency movement was washed into this coalition and into the mainstream politics mainly through the Indian effort. If we examine these interventions from a broader perspective, they reveal the pattern of behavior driven by the subcontinental imperatives described above. To ensure Indian security interests in the subcontinent were not threatened, they flowed from an acknowledgement that while India would respect their independent sovereignty in its neighbor, it would not hesitate to intervene if the security interests were threatened. Now, this was also implicit recognition that in terms of quotidian template, its neighbors would inevitably try to constrain India by engaging with the powerful countries both within and outside the region. This would remain an ever-present diplomatic challenge, but if the tendency created a threat beyond a certain threshold, India would take an action. Of course, this went against the principle of non-intervention and advocated by it on international stage, but closer home, real politics would ever be a stronger driver. The emergence of China as united communist state and its early determined move to establish a consolidated to control its using the military force over the vast territories of Xinjiang and Tibet, which bordered India, brought the two Asian giants each other at doorstep. Nehru had little doubt that China posed a threat to India, but acknowledged that India does not possess sufficient military resources to confront China military over Tibet. The response to China's challenge was therefore initially focused on promoting bilateral understanding that acknowledged China's assertion of sovereignty over Tibet, but assured that Tibet has a high degree of regional autonomy, its religious and cultural identity, and its special relationship with India. There was also a calculated effort to promote Chinese political integration into the emerging regional arrangements such as Bandung Process to the champions its permanent membership in UN Security Council in the place of Taiwan. Such a socialization process would restrain China's tendency towards a unilateral action, it was believed. This seemed to work initially in the period of 59 despite emerging differences over the alignment and Sino-India boundary. It was a revolt in Tibet and India grant an asylum to Dalai Lama in 69 that triggered the sharp downslide in the interaction between two countries, culminating the border war of 1962. Now, the confrontation between India and China created a steep, fast convergence of China's and Pakistan's strategic interests now targeted on the common adversary India. India responded by aligning itself with more closely with Soviet Union, which despite its ideological inclination shared its perception of China as a threat. The Soviet Union was willing to use its status as a permanent member of UNSC to neutralize Western pressure on India on the issue of Kashmir by using its veto power. In the time, a strong and lasting defense partnership developed between India and Soviet Union. This was further strengthened when US and China established a virtual alliance in 1971. This was a textbook example of dynamics of Kautilya-Mandal interstate relationship. For India, closer alignment with Soviet Union was logical, given the superpower own emerging adversarial, indeed hostile relationship with the China. For Soviet Union, India was its neighbor, which shared an imperative of restraining China. Similarly, China saw in Pakistan useful proxy against India. The pattern of allying with a hostile neighbor
coming into the play. In 1971, during Bangladesh War, India prevented China from intervening in the support of Pakistan by signing Indo-Soviet Treaty of Friendship. The Sino-Pakistan alliances has persisted and narrowed India's room for maneuver in a very big way for over a half of the centuries and more. Now, this may change it's only if the relations between India and Pakistan improve significantly or if Pakistan values as an ally diminishes in the China's calculation. Neither appears likely to at present. China's Pakistan Economic Corridor, which traverses India's claimed territory of Gilgit and Baltistan, presently under Pakistan occupation, has enhanced the role of Pakistan in the China global strategy, particularly the aim of seeking an alternative land route to Indian Ocean. The Chinese built a port of Gwadar on Pakistan-Balochistan coast, which is a terminus of routes across Pakistan from West China. It is one of the points at which maritime and land connectivity under the ambitious Chinese project One Belt, One Road come together. Over the past several decades, India foreign policy makers have had to work around to fix this constant. Even almost every other regional and global equation has undergone dramatic transformation. So this was the situation till Cold War. We were having a threat from our neighboring countries, okay, in multiple ways. Along with that, international relations were unstable, even going up and down, but still we could find certain good friends countries who can create a equilibrium or who can make a fulcrum for bringing stability and peace. Next we'll be coming with the foreign policy after post Cold War. Then we'll be coming for each individual neighboring countries and the countries which serve as an Indian interest.